Hello and welcome to the Realpolitik Confidential first ever country profile. Our first country profile is on Uganda. Uganda in 2025 is an authoritarian yet strategically pivotal state in East Africa. President Yoweri Museveni has been in power since 1986 and presides over a regime that has never witnessed a peaceful transfer of power. While the country enjoys relative surface stability, it comes at the cost of democratic backsliding and heavy-handed rule. This report provides a confidential, realpolitik analysis across key dimensions: internal stability, corruption, foreign alignments, security posture, economic leverage, and regional influence. This is made in order to highlight structural trends and recent developments. The aim of this Realpolitik Confidential Country Profile is in order to inform those who are not necessarily diplomats, intelligence analysts, or corporate strategists of Uganda's power dynamics, as well as the opportunities and risks in engaging with Kampala's leadership. Let's start with political and internal stability. One of the main regime's strengths is that Museveni has had a hold on power which remains firm as he approaches 40 years in office. Constitutional maneuvering has paved the way for his continued rule. Parliament scrapped presidential age limits in 2017, allowing the now 80-year-old Museveni to run again in 2026. The ruling National Resistance Movement, or NRM, dominates state institutions including a pliant electoral commission and a security apparatus loyal to the president. Museveni has entrenched a powerful patronage network that binds the military and elites to him through financial and political rewards. Crucially, the Ugandan People's Defence Force, or the UPDF, is a cornerstone of the regime's stability. Top generals are regime loyalists, many from Museveni's family or his inner circle. And the army is routinely deployed to quell dissent and secure elections. This fusion of party, military and state ensures that any immediate threats to Museveni's rule are contained. Rights groups note that repression has only intensified ahead of the 2026 polls. Let's discuss now the opposition and civil unrest. The opposition's charismatic youth-backed leader Bobi Wine, born Robert Kyagulanyi, won strong support in the disputed 2021 election but was met with violence, arrests and alleged fraud, ultimately losing to Museveni amid an unfair playing field. The opposition remains fragmented and faces constant harassment. Rallies are restricted, leaders frequently detained, and some opponents have fled into exile. In a worrying 2025 development, Museveni's government pushed through a law authorizing military trials for civilians, overriding a Supreme Court ruling that such trials were unconstitutional. This legal shift effectively militarizes justice for regime critics and exemplifies Kampala's readiness to sideline the judiciary in the name of national security interests. Museveni's son, General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, plays a prominent and polarizing role. As a senior military commander, widely seen as a possible successor, Muhoozi has openly threatened opposition figures on social media and even boasted of abducting and torturing an opposition bodyguard. Such incidents underscore the regime's climate of intimidation. Despite deep public frustration, especially among Uganda's very young population, with a median age of 16, facing unemployment and poor services, large-scale civil unrest has been sporadic due to swift crackdowns. Security forces have shown zero tolerance for protests. For example, a wave of demonstrations in late 2020 was met with lethal force, leaving dozens dead. Going forward, youth discontent is a latent tinderbox. However, unless the opposition unites or the military's loyalty wavers, the regime appears perfectly capable of containing unrest through coercion and divide and rule tactics. In the short term, Museveni's position is incontestably strong, bolstered by force and patronage, but the lack of an obvious succession plan and growing generational grievances pose long-term stability risks. Up next, we will discuss the corruption and patronage networks in Uganda. First, we have state capture. Corruption in Uganda is, after all, endemic and tightly interwoven with the regime's survival strategy. Museveni's government functions on a system of patronage that rewards loyalists with positions and wealth, resulting in what many observers describe as a state capture by a network of ruling elites. Oversight institutions exist, like the Inspectorate of Government and anti-graft laws, but are undermined by political interference and underfunding. The elite networks, often involving the first family and trusted lieutenants, dominate lucrative sectors and public contracts. For instance, Museveni's relatives hold key posts. His wife Janet is an education minister. His brother Salim Saleh wields influence in the economy and are believed to direct significant business dealings behind the scenes. This concentration of power facilitates grand corruption and impunity at the top, hollowing out institutional checks. Then we have the risk of institutional decay. The extent of corruption has reached staggering levels. Uganda's own Inspector General reported in 2025 that annual corruption costs the country about $2.4 billion, which is roughly a quarter of the national budget. An estimated 85% of civil service jobs at the district level are obtained through bribery rather than merit, indicating how deeply graft has penetrated the bureaucracy. Large corruption scandals regularly make headlines, but accountability is rare beyond scapegoating lower officials. Notably, even foreign courts have exposed Ugandan graft. In 2019, the US convicted a former Hong Kong minister for bribing Uganda's then Foreign Minister Sam Kutesa on behalf of a Chinese energy firm. Donor funds have been siphoned as well. A 2018 investigation revealed inflated refugee numbers and stolen aid within the office of the Prime Minister, prompting several Western donors to freeze assistance. Although prosecutions ensued for some mid-level staff, higher-level architects escaped punishment. The impunity of powerful figures perpetuates a culture of graft and weakens public institutions. Watchdogs like Freedom House note that officials often engage in corrupt practices with absolute impunity. Anti-corruption efforts by reformers are undercut by fear of reprisals. Surveys show Ugandans are deeply unhappy with graft but afraid to speak out. The net effect is institutional decay. The rule of law is eroded when courts and regulators can be swayed or coerced, and service delivery suffers as public funds are diverted. For foreign investors and partners, this translates to a challenging business climate. The US State Department bluntly warned in late 2023 that Uganda's persistent corruption and abuse of power creates serious legal and reputational risks for companies. Nonetheless, the regime's tight grip means that savvy external actors who navigate the patronage networks, often by partnering with regime-favored companies or intermediaries, can secure deals, albeit with the ethical and legal caveat that bribery is often the cost of entry. Corruption thus remains both a lubricant of the political system and a potential trigger for public anger if a major scandal ignites popular outrage. Now let's discuss Uganda's foreign policy and alliances. The key alliances of Uganda are the following. Uganda under Museveni practices a transactional, non-aligned foreign policy that seeks benefits from all sides. Traditionally a security ally of the West, Uganda has received substantial military aid and training from the United States, especially for its role in regional counter-terrorism. For example, it contributed troops to Somalia. Western governments have also lauded Uganda for hosting over 1.5 million refugees from neighboring conflicts. However, relations with the West have cooled in recent years amid Kampala's authoritarian turn and human rights abuses. Museveni bristles at Western criticism, dismissing it as neo-colonial interference, and has increasingly courted US rivals to diversify support. In early 2025, Uganda formally joined the BRICS bloc as a partner nation, aligning itself more closely with China and Russia's camp. Kampala also chaired the Non-Aligned Movement, or NAM, after hosting the NAM Summit in January 2024, reinforcing its stance of not being beholden to any superpower. This posture was evident in Uganda's abstention on United Nations votes condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Officials claimed neutrality was required of the NAM chair, rather than taking a side on this issue. Indeed, Museveni has openly maintained friendly ties with Moscow. He hosted Russia's foreign minister in 2022, for example, and secured pledges of economic cooperation, all while Uganda abstained from any sort of criticism, including on UN resolutions targeting Russia. In other words, it is a balancing East and West act by Uganda. China has emerged as a significant economic partner. Beijing, after all, funds major infrastructure projects in Uganda, from hydropower dams to road networks, and holds a growing share of Uganda's debt. Chinese companies like the CNOOC in oil and telecom firms are one such example. These are entrenched in the Ugandan economy, and China refrains from pressuring Kampala on governance issues. Russia's engagement is more about arms and symbolic diplomacy. Uganda's military has sourced equipment from Moscow, and Museveni sees value in portraying himself as a friend of Putin to leverage better deals or aid from the West. Meanwhile, Uganda's relations with the United States and Europe have turned rocky due to internal policies. The passage of a draconian Anti-Homosexuality Act, which includes the death penalty for certain same-sex acts, which was passed by the Ugandan parliament in 2023, sparked international outrage. In response, Washington terminated Uganda's eligibility for AGOA trade benefits and imposed visa bans on some officials. The World Bank suspended new loans in August 2023 over the AHA, demanding safeguards against discrimination. By mid-2025, after Uganda pledged mitigation measures, the bank cautiously lifted its freeze on funding. Such episodes illustrate Uganda's open-door diplomacy. Museveni is willing to weather Western sanctions and pivot to alternate partners when chastised on rights. In May 2025, Uganda's army even expelled Germany's military advisors, accusing the German ambassador of subversive activity for allegedly supporting opposition groups. This unprecedented step followed European diplomats' private criticism of Museveni's son. Kampala's swift retaliation signaled that it will prioritize regime pride and continuity over long-standing Western partnerships. Overall, Uganda's foreign policy is best characterized as pragmatically non-aligned. It remains an essential player for Western security interests in Africa on issues such as counter-terrorism, but it simultaneously deepens ties with China, Russia, and the Middle Eastern states. Museveni leverages this position by playing powers against each other. For instance, Uganda recently secured new investments from the United Arab Emirates, a top buyer of its gold, even as US officials raised alarms about illicit gold flows fueling conflicts. Kampala will continue to use its strategic cooperation on issues like terrorism and regional stability as a bargaining chip to extract aid or investment, all the while resisting external lectures on democracy. International actors dealing with Uganda should expect deal-making on Kampala's terms, often focusing on security or economic interests and minimally influenced by value-based appeasals. Now let us discuss the security interests and military posture of Uganda. Concerning military strength and posture, Uganda maintains one of sub-Saharan Africa's most capable and battle-tested militaries. The UPDF has benefited from years of US training and equipment as a reward for Uganda's contributions to international missions, and from real combat experience in multiple theaters. Museveni, himself a former guerrilla leader, has built a security apparatus adept at both conventional warfare and internal security operations. The military budget has swelled with the anticipated oil windfall, allowing Uganda to modernize its arsenal modestly, including tanks, artillery, and a small fleet of fighter jets, many of them produced by the Russians. Military loyalty remains a pillar of Museveni's regime, and as noted, the top brass are integrated into the patronage system. There are no signs of significant fissures within the security forces. Elite units like the Special Forces Command, once led by Muhoozi, are directly tied to Museveni. In 2025, Museveni even reintroduced broad military jurisdiction over civilians, underscoring that the army is empowered to handle the regime threats in all spheres. The president routinely reminds the forces of their role in safeguarding his conception of stability and democracy in Uganda. This loyalty, however, might be tested in a scenario of contested succession or if rank-and-file grievances over pay or corruption grow, a medium-term concern as Museveni increasingly ages. Now let's discuss the internal security challenges of Uganda. The regime faces a few low-level insurgent threats, though none currently pose an existential danger to Kampala. The most serious is the Allied Democratic Forces, or the ADF, a jihadist group originally Ugandan, but which operates from bases in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo and has aligned with the Islamic State. The ADF has staged lethal terror attacks in Uganda, including coordinated suicide bombings in Kampala in late 2021, which were claimed by the Islamic State. In response, Uganda has been aggressive. It launched joint military operations inside the DRC in 2021 under the name of Operation Shuja. Such operations continue to this day against the ADF militants. While Uganda touts progress, after all, in early 2025, Ugandan troops seized several ADF strongholds in the DRC's Ituri province. UN monitors question the effectiveness of these sweeps and even suspect Kampala of using the campaign to advance other interests. Apart from the ADF, Uganda has largely eliminated domestic rebel groups. The Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA, that once terrorized northern Uganda was chased out years ago. Periodic episodes of violence in the northeastern Karamoja region, which mostly consisted of cattle rider militias and sporadic armed groups attacks near the DRC or South Sudan borders, do occur, but the UPDF has overwhelming capacity to contain them. The government also employs extensive surveillance and an intelligence network to preempt political unrest. Reports have surfaced of Ugandan agencies having sophisticated spyware against dissidents and journalists. Overall, internal security is maintained through a mix of targeted counterinsurgency and ubiquitous repression of dissenters, yielding a tightly controlled environment. Let's discuss the regional military engagements of Uganda. Museveni has never shied from deploying forces beyond Uganda's borders to secure his interests. Uganda sees itself as a regional power broker, and the UPDF has been involved in multiple neighboring conflicts, both overtly or covertly. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda's history is checkered. The UPDF intervened in Congo's wars during the 1990s and in 2003 to support rebels and exploit resources, for which the International Court of Justice ordered Uganda to pay $325 billion in reparations for plunder and atrocities. In recent years, Kampala has presented itself as a partner to Kinshasa against Islamist rebels, but tensions remain. Ugandan forces in the eastern DRC raise suspicions due to Kampala's past support for groups like the M23 rebels. Notably, General Muhoozi has referred to the M23 insurgents as our brothers, fueling concern that Uganda could be hedging its bets in the DRC conflict. The rivalry with Rwanda also plays out on Congolese soil. Uganda and Rwanda jostle for influence in mining riches in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, each accused of backing proxy militias. In South Sudan, Uganda intervened decisively when civil war erupted in 2013, sending troops and aid power to prop up President Salva Kiir's government. Those forces withdrew after a peace deal, but Uganda continued supplying arms, skirting on UN embargoes, and remains ready to step back in. Indeed, in early 2025, as South Sudan's peace unraveled, Uganda quietly deployed forces and conducted airstrikes against rebel positions, with Muhoozi unabashedly boasting about being tired of killing Nuer and threatening to annihilate the insurgents. This blunt language, while indeed alarming, reflects Kampala's determination to secure its neighbors against a hostile takeover and to maintain its sway over Juba. Further afield, Uganda has been a core contributor to the African Union's mission in Somalia since 2007, fighting Al-Shabaab as part of the internationally funded effort there. This role earned Uganda considerable Western goodwill and combat experience, though Ugandan troops in Somalia have also faced allegations of abuses. The bottom line is that the security and regime survival interests are intertwined in Uganda's military deployments. Whether combating jihadists or shoring up an ally, Museveni uses the UPDF as an instrument of projecting power. This has been the case for many an African state of using military forces in order to achieve power projection, but Museveni does this par excellence. For example, he utilizes them to gain leverage by, say, demanding aid in return for contributions to peacekeeping, and sometimes to access economic spoils like smuggled gold and timber from conflict zones. Internationally, this makes Uganda both a valuable security partner and somewhat a wild card. Its troops can help stabilize hotspots, but Uganda may pursue agendas at odds with broader peace efforts, as seen in the uneasy Great Lakes region. Let's discuss the economic and resource leverage next. Well, when it comes to natural resources, for example oil and minerals, Uganda is on the cusp of major economic shifts due to its natural resource endowments. The most transformative is oil. Roughly 1.4 billion barrels of recoverable oil have been confirmed in the Albertine Graben region in western Uganda, and after years of delays, production is now imminent. In fact, drilling began in 2023, and Uganda expects to pump out up to 230,000 barrels per day at peak, putting it in league with mid-sized African producers like Gabon. A consortium led by France's Total Energies and China's CNOOC is developing the fields with significant project underway. This project is supposed to construct the 1,440-kilometer East African crude oil pipeline through Tanzania to the Indian Ocean. This approximately $4 billion pipeline is the world's longest heated pipeline and has faced financing challenges and opposition by environmental and human rights activists. Nonetheless, Kampala views oil as a game changer. The International Monetary Fund estimates that Uganda's GDP growth could exceed 12% annually in 2026 if oil comes online as planned. Museveni has promised to channel oil revenues into infrastructure and industrialization, aiming to lift Uganda into a middle-income status. However, there are concerns that oil wealth could entrench kleptocracy inside Uganda. The secrecy around production sharing agreements and the involvement of the president's inner circle in oil decision-making suggests a risk that oil proceeds might be captured by elites rather than broad-based development. External actors should note that Uganda will likely leverage competition between Western and Chinese firms for all sectors, contracts, and in order to extract favorable terms to pit them against each other. For example, an American company, McDermott, has a stake in building the production facilities, indicating Kampala's openness to diverse partners so long as its interests are served. Beyond oil, we have minerals, which have become a strategic economic lever. Uganda has significant untapped deposits of copper, cobalt, iron ore, rare earth elements, and gold. In 2022, officials announced a massive gold discovery and have since licensed a Chinese firm to build a large gold mine and refinery expected to start output in late 2025. Gold is already Uganda's top export earner. Remarkably, gold exports surged from just $10 million in 2008 to $2.3 billion in 2023. Yet this boom owes largely to the fact that Uganda has a role as a regional gold transit and refining hub rather than domestic mining. Over 90% of gold from neighboring conflict zones, especially eastern DRC, is estimated to be smuggled through Uganda and Rwanda. And Uganda's largest refinery was sanctioned by the US Treasury in 2022 for dealing in illicit blood gold. Museveni's government publicly denies involvement in trafficking, but the scale of the trade and reports of high-level Ugandan facilitation of smuggling networks suggest that the informal resource flows are an economic lifeline and likely enrich powerful figures inside the state apparatus. Uganda similarly profits from re-exporting minerals like coltan and tantalum sourced from the DRC, often skirting international sanctions. This shadow economy underpins Kampala's finances and gives it leverage. For instance, the UAE, a major gold buyer, courts Uganda for access to these resources, leading to deepening economic ties between Kampala and the Gulf states. However, reliance on illicit trade attracts scrutiny and could trigger new sanctions or loss of trade privileges if Uganda is seen as abetting conflict finance. Let's discuss now investment and strategic interests inside of Uganda. Uganda's broader economy is diverse, but it faces structural issues. Agriculture mostly focuses around coffee, tea, fishing, and so on and so forth, but still employs the majority, and manufacturing is nascent. Museveni administration markets Uganda as an emerging investment destination, citing opportunities in infrastructure, energy, and consumer markets. Foreign investments and trends show rising interest from non-traditional partners. China is noted, but also Turkey, India, and Middle Eastern investors are active. Western investment has plateaued due to governance concerns, for example, the aforementioned anti-LGBT law of 2023. Some Western companies reconsidered or paused projects to avoid reputational damage. Multilateral donors like the World Bank and IMF continue to lend, but with conditions. And Japan and European nations fund selective development programs, but there is wariness. Uganda has reacted by emphasizing the South-South partnerships. Its entry into BRICS circles could open access to new development financing alternatives. For example, BRICS's new development bank loans or bilateral deals with China or Russia. Meanwhile, regionally, Uganda is positioning itself as an infrastructure hub. It's investing in electricity generation. After all, it has two large Chinese-built dams which recently came online, making Uganda an energy exporter. And it's also pushing for regional railway and road links that could boost trade. As East Africa becomes more integrated, Uganda wants to ensure its oil, agriculture, and manufacturing can reach ports and markets efficiently, reducing dependence on any single transit country such as Kenya. In terms of economic leverage, Uganda's leadership understands that strategic value of resources is the name of the game, and also it understands its geography. Oil deals mining concessions, and market access are implicitly tied to political loyalty. Countries that refrain from criticizing Museveni's regime find a smoother path in business. Conversely, firms from nations pressuring Uganda on human rights may find themselves edged out of lucrative contracts. International actors should recognize that Uganda's economic future, be it from the oil wealth, minerals, or regional trade, is something that the regime will safeguard jealously. The coming years will determine whether oil turns Uganda into a petro-state marked by greater corruption, or if managed investment can spur broader growth in the region. Either way, in the medium term, oil and mineral revenues will bolster the regime's staying in power, providing funds to pacify the military and the population and potentially reducing Uganda's dependence on Western aid, thus further freeing Museveni's hand internationally. Now let us discuss the regional influence and the diplomatic sphere. Let's discuss the relationships which Uganda has with its neighbors. Uganda is a heavyweight in East and Central Africa's geopolitics. President Museveni, as one of Africa's longest-serving leaders, turning 81 in 2025, is often viewed as a senior statesman whose voice carries weight beyond Uganda's borders. He has been a key player in regional conflicts and peacemaking for decades, though not always on the side of stability. Relations with each neighbor are a mix of cooperation and rivalry. Let's discuss Kenya first. Uganda's economic lifeline runs through Kenya. The Mombasa port handles most Ugandan trade. Relations are generally cooperative, anchored by trade and investment. Museveni and Kenya's leaders have kept ties cordial, but a surprising hiccup emerged in late 2022 when General Muhoozi Kainerugaba tweeted threats about invading Kenya, forcing Museveni to apologize to Nairobi. This episode aside, Uganda and Kenya work together in the East African Community, or the EAC, and Uganda's stability is seen as vital by Kenya in order to avoid refugee influxes or any sort of trade disruption. Both countries benefit from the planned extension of standard gauge railways and joint infrastructure projects. However, Uganda also eyes alternative routes through Tanzania to reduce over-reliance on Kenya. As of 2025, the two maintain a strategic and pragmatic partnership, even though Kenya monitors Museveni's eventual succession warily, knowing instability in Uganda could spill over into their own country. Now let's discuss Rwanda. Ties with Rwanda are complex and historically fraught. Museveni and Rwanda's President Paul Kagame were once allies. After all, Museveni supported Kagame's rebel movement in the 1980s and the 1990s, but today they compete for influence in the region. In 2019, Rwanda abruptly closed its border with Uganda over accusation that Kampala was detaining Rwandan agents and aiding anti-Kagame rebels. Standoff happily eased in 2022 after talks and borders reopened, but mistrust persists to this day. The Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo is the key friction point. Both Uganda and Rwanda have security and economic interests there, be they smuggling rackets or rebel proxies. UN experts have cited both countries for backing the M23 rebellion at different times. When Uganda joined the regional EAC military mission in the DRC in 2022 and 2023, Congolese suspicion ran high that Kampala had ulterior motives, given Muhoozi's open sympathy for M23. Museveni and Kagame have since mended personal fences to a degree, a bromance of convenience, if you will, but each remains wary of the other's intent. Diplomatically, Uganda and Rwanda often coordinate in the EAC and African Union. But any shift in the delicate balance, for instance if Museveni were to exit the scene, could reignite tensions between the two African states. Tanzania is another example of Uganda's interesting relationships. Relations with Tanzania are largely positive, forged through EAC partnerships and the shared oil pipeline project. Tanzania's president has a good rapport with Museveni, and the EACOP pipeline running from Uganda to Tanzania's coast symbolizes a strategic alliance. The two countries have a history. Tanzania helped oust Uganda's Idi Amin in the 1979 time span. Yet under Museveni, Uganda and Tanzania have been close. They jointly advocate for EAC integration and often take similar stances inside the African Union. Tanzania provides Uganda with an invaluable outlet to the sea, independent of Kenya's politics. So Museveni prioritizes this friendship. Barring unforeseen disputes, Uganda and Tanzania ties in 2025 are strong and likely to deepen economically. Then we have the South Sudan. Uganda has been deeply involved in South Sudan, seeing it as a part of its sphere of influence. Museveni was instrumental in South Sudan's independence, supporting, for example, the SPLM rebellion against Sudan's Khartoum regime since the 1980s. When South Sudan descended into civil war, Uganda's military intervened decisively to protect Juba and key installations. The intervention secured President Kiir in power and safeguarded Ugandan trade interests. South Sudan, after all, was a lucrative market for Ugandan goods until war disrupted it. Uganda also hosts over 1 million South Sudanese refugees, giving it a humanitarian credence and leverage in the international stage. In 2025, as South Sudan's peace deal falters, Uganda is again playing kingmaker, deploying troops and carrying out strikes purportedly to prevent a rebel victory. This indicates Uganda will do whatever necessary to maintain a friendly regime in Juba. The relationship is, after all, symbiotic. South Sudan's leadership depends on Ugandan protection, and Uganda gains a client state and economic partner for pipelines or trade or whatever they decide to endeavor. Internationally, some neighbors worry Uganda's influence in South Sudan undermines impartial peace efforts, but without Uganda's buy-in, no regional solution is likely to hold. Let's discuss the Democratic Republic of Congo last. Uganda's engagement in the DRC is both opportunistic and security-driven. On one hand, Uganda seeks stability on its western frontier and has cooperated with the DRC's government to fight the ADF insurgents. On the other hand, the lure of DRC's vast resources has repeatedly drawn Uganda in. Even in 2025, while Ugandan troops operate in eastern Congo with Kinshasa's consent, questions linger about Kampala's true aims in the region. Evidence of Ugandan involvement in smuggling Congolese gold, timber and other resources continues to surface. Additionally, Uganda's harboring of certain DRC rebel leaders in the past and M23 fighters creates distrust between the two African capitals. President Felix Tshisekedi of the DRC has to balance welcoming Uganda's help against the ADF with preventing Uganda from entrenching itself economically inside its own country. Regionally, Uganda backs diplomatic initiatives like the Nairobi process for DRC peace, but it likely will safeguard its interests, such as securing trade routes and mining concessions in the eastern Congo. Regardless of what peace deals dictate, this approach means Uganda's influence in the Great Lakes region is viewed with a mix of appreciation and caution by its neighbors. Beyond immediate neighbors, Uganda is active in a broader continental diplomatic effort. Museveni's positioned himself as a Pan-African elder. He vigorously champions that the East African Federation idea comes to fruition. He is calling for the EAC's political union as a means for African strength. Under his guidance, Uganda often takes on a leadership role in the African Union and various regional blocs. For example, we have the IGAD for Horn of Africa matters. Kampala's clout in the African Union is moderate but significant on issues where Uganda has direct involvement, like the Somalia mission or African standby forces. Notably, Uganda's NAM chairmanship and outreach to the Global South has elevated its profile. Museveni has forged new partnerships with countries like Iran on energy cooperation, North Korea in the past for arms training, though officially it was halted under sanctions, and India on issues such as pharmaceuticals and vehicle assembly investments. This is all about leveraging an image of a country that defies Western dictates. This ability to convene or speak for blocs of developing nations, for example leading the G77 at the UN in some sessions, gives Uganda diplomatic weight beyond its economic size. In summary, Uganda's regional influence is characterized by a blend of hard power and diplomacy. It uses military might to shape outcomes in its neighborhood, and diplomacy to punch above its weight in continental forums. For international actors engaging, Uganda often requires understanding this dual nature. Kampala can be a partner in stabilizing the region, but it also unapologetically pursues its own hegemonic interests in Eastern Africa. Any regional initiative, be it a peace process, economic integration or a security pact, will have to account for Uganda's buy-in, as Museveni can either be a spoiler or a linchpin. Let's look at the outlook, opportunities and risks for international actors. Uganda's trajectory presents a nuanced mix of opportunities and risks for those looking to engage, whether in diplomacy, security, cooperation or business. Below we highlight key opportunities and risks in 2025's Uganda. Let's discuss the first opportunity. Uganda as a strategic security partner. Uganda's robust military and willingness to deploy makes it a valuable ally in a volatile region. International actors such as the US, the UN or the African Union can partner with Uganda on issues such as counter-terrorism as well as peacekeeping operations. Kampala's commitment of troops in Somalia and willingness to respond to regional crises can be leveraged in exchange for training, equipment or funding. For Western nations, Uganda offers a reliable base and staging ground for security initiatives in East Africa. Then we have the huge resource investment potential. With first oil production on the horizon, Uganda is poised for an oil boom. This opens opportunities for foreign energy firms and investors in extraction infrastructure from pipelines to refinery and associated sectors, be they petrochemicals or power generation. Likewise, mineral development, be they gold, cobalt or rare earths, are ramping up, and Uganda is eager for capital and technological investment. Countries that maintain good relations and avoid lecturing Uganda on internal matters might find themselves granted mining licenses, oil field stakes, or construction contracts. There is considerable upsides for companies from Asia and Middle East already positioning themselves for those deals, but Western companies can still compete if they tread carefully. Let's discuss also the regional market access. Uganda's central location in the East Africa, bordering 7 countries and membership in the EAC, now a 8-nation common market, makes it a gateway to regional markets that exceed 300 million people. Investors in Uganda can tap into the EAC's trade preferences and the planned EAC political federation, which Museveni strongly advocates for. Uganda's improving infrastructure, be they roads, dams, or potential railways, and relatively stable macroeconomic outlook with high growth expected mean it could serve as a regional logistics and manufacturing hub. International firms might use Uganda as a base to access South Sudan, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, or Rwanda, markets where Uganda has influence and insight as well. Then we have diplomatic leverage via Museveni. Museveni's status as a regional elder statesman and NAM chair gives foreign powers an opportunity to quietly influence African positions through him. He can be an interlocutor in conflicts. After all, he has mediated in Burundi and South Sudan in the past and is often keen to act as a spokesperson for Africa on the world stage. Courting Museveni's favor through states visits, development projects, or defense cooperation can yield support in multilateral forums. For example, he can rally support with the African Union on certain votes or lend weight to initiatives like the fight against climate change, provided they don't threaten Uganda's oil interests. Diplomats and business people alike might find Museveni's pragmatic approach useful in behind-the-scenes negotiations that require an African statesman's endorsement. Now let's discuss the risks. We have political volatility and succession crises. Despite short-term stability, Uganda faces a looming succession dilemma. Museveni's intent to run again in 2026 suggests continuity, but at 80 years of age, the probability of a sudden health crisis or eventual transition is rising. A chaotic succession struggle, possibly between Museveni's son Muhoozi and other contenders within the ruling elite, could trigger internal rifts or violence. The military's loyalty is not guaranteed to transfer seamlessly to a successor, which poses a risk of factional split. For international stakeholders, this means investments and agreements could be thrown into uncertainty in a post-Museveni scenario. Any hint of instability around the 2026 election, for example a disputed result or mass protests which are met by force, could disrupt operations and require contingency planning for expatriates and assets alike. Then we have the authoritarian backlash and sanctions. The Ugandan government has a human rights record which is increasingly becoming a liability. Crackdowns on opposition, torture of detainees, and draconian laws like the Anti-Homosexuality Act has already led to aid cuts and sanctions. If repression intensifies as expected ahead of the election, Uganda could face deeper diplomatic isolation from Western partners. Companies operating in Uganda risk being entangled in sanctions. For instance, if Ugandan security forces or officials they deal with are sanctioned for abuses or corruption, this could mean both reputational and financial losses for said company. Reputational risks are high for businesses seen as abetting an oppressive regime. Western governments might also condition cooperation on improvements in governance, which would reduce Uganda's reliability as a partner. On the flip side, Uganda's pivot to illiberal partners means Western influence will wane, diminishing leverage to protect investments or citizens if relations sour. Then we have corruption and legal risks. As outlined, corruption is pervasive and poses direct risks to foreign businesses. Firms may face demands for bribes or unofficial fees at multiple levels, raising legal exposure under laws like the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Act. Public procurement is often rigged in favor of insiders, disadvantaging fair competition. There's also the risk of sudden regulatory or tax pressure on companies not aligned with powerful interests. Moreover, sectors like mining and oil carry resource nationalism risk. The government could change terms or expropriate assets if it deems that politically expedient. Investors must conduct rigorous due diligence on local partners, many of whom will have political ties. The judiciary offers limited recourse in disputes involving a regime cronies, so contract enforcement is shaky at best. In short, the rule of law deficit and graft could undermine otherwise promising ventures, and any foreign partner must be prepared for opaque, personality-driven deal-making. Then we have the risk of a potential security spillover. Uganda's entanglement in regional conflicts could backfire, drawing the country and by extension its partners into broader insecurity. For example, a deterioration of the situation in the eastern DRC if Uganda and Rwandan proxies game escalates could destabilize the borderlands and threaten regional trade routes. Likewise, deeper Ugandan involvement in the South Sudan or inside the Sudan itself carries risks of retaliation. Rebel groups could target Ugandan interests or even attempt terror attacks inside of Uganda. The ADF jihadist threat, while contained, is not entirely neutralized. A successful large-scale terror strike in Kampala or against foreign targets would abruptly alter the risks to the environment. Additionally, if Uganda's forces suffer a major setback or atrocity abroad, for example heavy casualties in a regional mission or an international scandal involving Ugandan troops, Museveni might double down militarily or retreat unpredictably, affecting regional stability. International actors, after all, should monitor these flashpoints, as Uganda's security commitments can both enable partnerships when goals align and create liabilities if conflicts spiral. Then we have economic uncertainties. Though oil promises riches, it also brings economic risks. A collapse in oil prices or delays in production would strain Uganda's finances, potentially leading the government to accumulate unsustainable debt or suddenly court emergency aid. Inflation and youth unemployment remains underlying issues. If oil revenues are mismanaged, public frustration could mount, feeding unrest despite heavy police presence. External financiers such as the World Bank, the IMF, or China's Exim Bank hold significant sway via loans, and any debt distress could force policy changes or austerity that provokes backlashes inside the system. Additionally, Uganda's reliance on commodity exports, be they oil or gold, exposes it to market fluctuations and climate change effects. Droughts, for example, have been noted to hurt agriculture in the region. For investors, this means a profitable boom is possible, but so is the boom-bust scenario with policy volatility. Should Uganda face balance of payment trouble, currency risks would rise, potentially eroding returns. In sum, while Uganda has high growth potential, it is not without macroeconomic fragility and policy unpredictability, which international businesses and donors must factor into their long-term plans. In conclusion, Uganda presents a classic realpolitik case of a regime that is simultaneously a stabilizing force and a source of regional challenges. Museveni's government will continue to engage external partners on its own terms, valuing those who bolster its security and economic goals and showing hostility to those who threaten its hold on power. International actors should approach Uganda with clear-eyed pragmatism, engage where interests align, be they security cooperation opportunities, investment in priority sectors, but prepare for sudden policy shifts and ethical dilemmas. Opportunities in Uganda are significant given its strategic location and impending resource boom, but they come interwoven with the risks inherent in a patronage-based autocracy approaching a moment of generational transition. It's best when dealing with Uganda to maintain a calibrated engagement, one that safeguards interests while encouraging gradual positive change. This will prove to be a challenge in dealing with Uganda in 2025 and beyond. Nevertheless, it is a fairy tale to imagine that Uganda will suddenly become the Netherlands when it comes to human rights or economic best practices. However, balancing the West's morals with the inevitable economic opportunity represented by Uganda will be the challenge in dealing with them in 2025 and beyond. Thank you for listening to our first country profile by Realpolitik Confidential. We will continue to deal with interesting countries, but at some point we will cover all countries in the world. The point of this endeavor is to educate those who might be interested in the opportunities represented by these states, but don't really belong to, let's say, a corporate elite or a diplomatic service. Thank you for listening. I have been Alex Krishan, the host of Realpolitik Confidential. God bless you all and have a lovely day wherever you are.